There is a chapter in the Bible that most people have heard referenced at some point in their lives, even if they have never actually sat down and read it carefully. It is a chapter that speaks to something every single human being on this earth is quietly searching for, whether they know it or not. And that thing is freedom. Real freedom. Not the kind of freedom that disappears when life gets hard. Not the kind of freedom that depends on your circumstances being perfect. And not the kind of freedom that you have to perform for or earn through a long list of rules. We are talking about something far deeper than any of that. Something that touches the innermost part of who you are. And if you have been carrying something heavy lately, if you have been wondering whether there is more to this life than what you have been experiencing, or if you have been asking yourself quietly whether God is truly near to you, then I want you to know that what is contained in this chapter of Scripture was written for you. It was written with you in mind. Before we go any further together, I just want to gently invite you to subscribe to this channel if you have not already. Now, the chapter we are opening today is the 5th chapter of the letter to the Galatians, and the very first thing the Apostle Paul says in this chapter is one of the most breathtaking sentences in all of Scripture. He says that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Let that land for a moment. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free, not so that you could follow a longer list of rules, not so that you could impress the people around you at church, not so that you could prove something to God. Christ set you free so that you could actually be free. That is the whole point. That is what this chapter is opening with, and it sets the entire tone for everything that follows. But here is where it gets interesting, and where many people get confused about what Christian freedom actually means. Because when people hear the word freedom in a spiritual context, they often imagine one of two things. Either they imagine a kind of freedom that means anything goes, where you can live however you want because grace covers it all, or they imagine a freedom that is still secretly wrapped up in rules and expectations, where you are technically free, but you still feel this invisible pressure to perform and measure up and never quite fall short. And neither of those pictures is what Paul is describing in this chapter. Neither of those pictures is what Jesus actually offers you. What Paul is talking about here is something that goes much, much deeper than rules or the absence of rules. He is talking about a transformation of the heart itself. He is talking about a freedom that comes not from changing the laws that are written around you, but from changing the nature that is working within you. And that is the heart of what the 5th chapter of the letter to the Galatians is really about. This is not primarily a chapter about behavior. It is a chapter about source. It is a chapter that asks you a very personal and very revealing question. And that question is this: where are you living from? Think about that for just a second, because it is a genuinely important question for every one of us. Where are you living from? Are you living from a place of fear, constantly trying to manage how other people see you, constantly trying to make sure you are doing enough to feel okay about yourself before God? Are you living from a place of exhaustion, carrying burdens that were never actually yours to carry? Are you living from a place of habit, just going through the motions of a spiritual life without really feeling any connection to the living God behind it all? These are real places that real people live from every single day, and there is no shame in admitting that you have been in one of them. Most of us have. But what Paul is making clear in this chapter is that God never intended for you to stay in any of those places. The context of the letter to the Galatians is actually quite striking when you understand what was happening at the time it was written. The churches in the region of Galatia had come to faith in Jesus. They had received the gospel. They had been transformed. They had experienced something real in their encounter with Christ. But then something began to happen that began to pull them away from that freedom. There were people who came into those churches and began teaching that faith in Jesus was not quite enough, that in order to truly belong, in order to truly be right with God, you also needed to take on the practices of the Jewish law, particularly the practice of circumcision, which was a mark of belonging under the Old Covenant. And Paul writes this entire letter with a kind of urgency and deep pastoral concern, because he can see what is happening to these people. He can see that they are being pulled back into a kind of bondage, back into the idea that their relationship with God depends on their performance rather than on the grace of Jesus. And when he gets to the 5th chapter, he draws a very clear and very honest line in the sand. He says, "Stand firm, then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." The image he uses here is so vivid, a yoke of slavery. He is picturing an ox with a heavy wooden beam across its neck, forcing it to walk in a direction it would not choose, under a weight it did not freely take on. And Paul is saying to these believers, and I believe he is saying it to you today as well, you were not made to live like that. You were not meant to walk through your life with that kind of weight on you. The yoke of trying to earn your way, the yoke of trying to perform your way into God's favor, the yoke of measuring your worth by your spiritual productivity. All of that is what Jesus came to lift off of you. And Paul is deeply concerned because these people, having already been set free, are now voluntarily picking that yoke back up and putting it on themselves. Does that resonate with anything in your own experience? Because I think a lot of people who would genuinely call themselves followers of Jesus are actually living under a quiet version of that same yoke. Not in the exact same way the Galatians were, but in spirit, in feeling, in the way they approach their relationship with God. There is this underlying sense that they have to keep doing enough, keep praying enough, keep serving enough, keep getting it right enough, or something bad is going to happen, or God is going to pull away from them, or they are going to lose the ground they have gained. And I want to speak gently, but honestly to that. That is not the freedom Christ died to give you. That is not what the gospel is. The gospel is not a new and more spiritual form of self-improvement. The gospel is the announcement that Jesus has already done what you could never do, and that he is offering you his life in exchange for your striving. Now, Paul does something really important in the middle of this chapter. He begins to describe two different ways of living, and he calls them living by the flesh and living by the Spirit. And I want to be careful here to make sure we understand what he means by flesh, because it is easy to read that word and immediately think only about obvious physical sins. But when Paul uses the word flesh in this context, he is actually talking about something much broader. He is talking about that whole orientation of the self that operates independently from God. The flesh, in Paul's vocabulary, is the part of you that tries to run your own life on your own terms, through your own strength, whether that shows up as what most people think of as obvious moral failure, or whether it shows up as a very religious and respectable kind of self-sufficiency that just happens to leave God out of the center. And then he lists what he calls the works of the flesh. And reading through that list is a humbling experience, because it is not a list of things that only obviously bad people struggle with. There is hatred in that list, and discord, and jealousy, and fits of rage, and selfish ambition, and dissension, and envy. These are things that can live very quietly inside very respectable people, including people who go to church every week and know all the right words and serve in all the right ministries. The flesh is not primarily about the scandalous things. The flesh is about the orientation of the heart. It is about who is actually on the throne of your life. And Paul is saying that when the flesh is driving, the natural result is a life that is characterized by fragmentation and conflict and broken relationships and an inner restlessness that never quite settles. But then Paul turns and he describes what happens when someone begins to live by the Spirit. And the contrast is striking, because he does not describe a life that becomes suddenly perfect or free of difficulty or challenge. He describes a life that begins to bear fruit. And the image of fruit is such a beautiful one when you think about it carefully, because you do not force fruit to grow. You do not lecture an apple tree into producing apples. The fruit is the natural, organic outflow of the kind of tree it is, and the kind of roots it has, and the kind of soil it is drawing its nourishment from. And Paul is saying that when you are genuinely connected to the Spirit of God, when you are drawing your life from that source, rather than from your own effort and striving. Something begins to happen in you that you did not manufacture. Something begins to grow. He calls it the fruit of the Spirit. And the list he gives is one of the most beautiful in all of Scripture: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Now, when most people encounter this list, the temptation is immediately to turn it into another performance checklist. To look at love and think, okay, I need to be more loving. To look at patience and think, I need to work harder on my patience. And while intention and effort are not bad things, that is completely missing the point of what Paul is saying here. Because Paul is not giving you a list of things to achieve. He is describing the natural characteristics of a life that has surrendered its source to the Spirit of God. These things are fruit. They grow. They emerge. They appear not because you gritted your teeth and tried harder, but because the Spirit of the living God was at work in the soil of your heart, cultivating something that you could not have produced on your own. And here is where I want to invite you into a moment of honest, quiet reflection, because I think this is one of the most practically significant things in this entire chapter. Think about the areas of your life right now where you feel the least free. Maybe it is a relationship where there is constant tension, and no matter how hard you try, nothing seems to resolve. Maybe it is a habit or a pattern of thinking that you have tried to break 100 times on your own, and it just keeps coming back. Maybe it is a deep restlessness that lives just underneath the surface of your days. This nagging feeling that something is missing, even when your external life looks reasonably put together. Maybe it is an anger that flares up more than you want it to, or a fear that quietly shapes your decisions, or a loneliness that sits in you even when you are surrounded by people. The question this chapter is asking you to consider is not simply whether you are trying hard enough to fix those things. The question is, what source are you drawing from as you try to live? Because the promise of this chapter is not that following Jesus makes everything instantly easy, or that the fruit of the Spirit appears overnight like some kind of spiritual microwave. The promise is that there is a life available to you that is genuinely different from what you can produce through your own willpower and management and effort. There is a vine, as Jesus describes it in the Gospel of John, chapter 15. And when you remain connected to that vine, when you stay close to Him, not as a performance, but as a relationship, something begins to happen. The fruit begins to appear. Not all at once, and not without its seasons of pruning and difficulty, but genuinely, truly, sustainably, it begins to appear. There is something else in this chapter that I think is deeply important for how we actually experience this freedom in daily life. Paul says near the end of this passage that those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. And I know that can sound like intense or even uncomfortable language at first. But what Paul is describing is not self-punishment or self-hatred. He is describing a decision, a settled, ongoing decision that you make not as an act of willpower, but as an act of trust. The decision that says, I am not going to continue to live from that old source. I am going to keep coming back to the Spirit. I am going to keep turning my heart in that direction. I am going to keep choosing to draw from the well of what God has placed in me, rather than from the stale and always unsatisfying water of my own striving. And what is remarkable, what I have seen over and over again in the lives of people who make that decision, sometimes quietly, sometimes in a moment of complete breaking, is that something begins to shift that they cannot entirely explain. The peace that Paul describes as part of the fruit of the Spirit is not a peace that makes sense according to circumstances. It is a peace that arrives from somewhere beyond the circumstances. It is a peace that you find yourself carrying in situations where you have absolutely no logical reason to feel peaceful. And that is not a sales pitch. That is what happens when the Spirit of God is genuinely at work in a human life. It is not always dramatic. It is not always accompanied by great emotional experiences, but it is real. It is sustainable. and it is unlike anything the world can offer you or that you can manufacture for yourself. This is why Paul ends this section with such a simple and direct instruction. He says, "Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit." And I love that phrase, keep in step with the Spirit. It is a walking image. It is not a sprinting image. It is not a striving image. It is not a performing image. It is a walking image, one step at a time, in rhythm with the one who is already going where you need to go. This is what the Christian life actually looks like at its core. Not a heroic solo effort to become someone better. Not a religious performance designed to satisfy an impossible standard, but a daily walk with a person, a daily, step-by-step, sometimes stumbling, but always continuing walk with Jesus through the presence of His Spirit living in you. I want to take a moment here and speak to you if you are someone who has been trying to find this freedom, but it has felt very far away. Maybe you have been in church for a long time and you know all the right answers, but the peace and the joy and the love that Paul describes here feel like they belong to some other kind of Christian, some more spiritually advanced kind that you have not managed to become yet. Maybe you have walked away from faith at some point because the version of it you encountered felt more like a burden than a liberation, more like a list of demands than an invitation into something beautiful. Or maybe you are brand new to all of this and you are just beginning to wonder whether what Jesus offers might actually be real. To every one of you, in whatever place you are sitting right now, I want to say this as clearly and as kindly as I can. The freedom that Galatians Chapter 5 is describing is not reserved for the spiritually elite. It is not on the other side of having your act completely together. It is not waiting for you at the end of a long enough journey of self-improvement. It is available to you right now, not because of anything you have done or are currently doing, but because of what Jesus has already done. The door to this freedom was opened by His life, His death, and His resurrection, and it stands open before you at this very moment. And the invitation of this chapter is simply this: step in. Stop standing outside it, trying to earn your way in. Step in by faith. Turn your heart toward the Spirit. Begin to walk. Now, I want to make sure we do not rush past the relational dimension of all of this, because I think it is one of the most easily overlooked aspects of what Paul is teaching in this chapter. When he talks about living by the Spirit and keeping in step with the Spirit, he is not describing a solo spiritual discipline. He is describing a life lived in relationship. The Spirit of God is not an impersonal force or a spiritual energy. The Spirit is the Spirit of Jesus Christ Himself, living in you and among you. And keeping in step with the Spirit means staying in relationship. It means talking to Him, listening to Him, trusting Him when things feel uncertain, turning to Him when you fail, receiving His grace when you need it, which is to say, all of the time. And this is reflected in what the fruit of the Spirit actually looks like in practice. Because if you look at that list again, almost every item on it is fundamentally relational. Love, kindness, gentleness, peace, patience. These are not primarily interior states. They are ways of being with other people. They are the natural expressions of a heart that has been transformed from the inside by the presence of God, and that is not something you can fake your way into for very long. You can manage your behavior for a while. You can perform kindness and patience if you are trying hard enough. But the fruit that Paul describes here is not managed behavior. It is transformed character. And transformed character comes from a transformed source. It comes from surrender. It comes from choosing, again and again, to live from the Spirit rather than from the flesh. There is something I think about often when I read this chapter, and it is this. Some of the people who encountered Jesus during His earthly life were transformed so completely and so quickly that it astonished everyone around them. People who had been bound by things for years, people who had given up on themselves, people whose lives had fallen apart in ways that felt utterly irreversible. And when they came into contact with Jesus, something happened that could not be accounted for by willpower or by religious discipline or by any merely human explanation. Something shifted at the level of the heart, at the level of the source, and the change that followed was visible to everyone around them. I am not saying that this always looks dramatic or sudden. For most of us, it is a slower and more gradual unfolding. But the same Spirit who was at work in those encounters is the same Spirit that Paul is describing in this chapter, the same Spirit that is available to you today. And maybe you have been searching for that. Maybe you have tried a lot of different things, looking for the peace and the freedom and the sense of being genuinely known and genuinely loved that every human heart is quietly longing for. Maybe you have looked for it in relationships, or in achievement, or in distraction, or in religion itself, in its more performance-based forms. And maybe none of it has quite delivered what it promised. If that is where you are, I want to say to you, very gently, that what you are looking for is real. It exists. And it is found in a person, not in a program, or a method, or a set of spiritual practices that you execute perfectly enough. It is found in Jesus, in the actual, living, risen, present Jesus. And the way into that freedom is not complicated, though it is also not trivial. It is surrender. It is the willingness to say, I cannot do this on my own. I have been trying, and it has not worked, and I am turning toward you. I am asking you to live in me and through me. I am choosing to keep in step with your Spirit rather than with my own striving. The letter to the Galatians, Chapter 5, is ultimately a love letter. It is a letter written by someone who cared deeply about people, who were in danger of losing something precious, who were in danger of exchanging the freedom of the gospel for a new and subtler form of bondage. And the message of that love letter is still just as urgent and just as relevant and just as personal today as it was when Paul first wrote it. Because the temptation to put the yoke of performance back on your neck is not a first-century problem. It is a human problem. It is a daily problem. And the answer to it is the same today as it was then. Stand firm in the freedom that Christ has given you. Do not let anything, not religious pressure, not your own guilt, not the voice that tells you that you will never be enough, pull you back into that yoke. You were set free for freedom. And the Spirit of the living God is available to you this very moment to help you walk in it. If you find yourself at the end of this video feeling something stirring in you, something that feels like a longing or a recognition or even just a quiet sense of yes, that is something worth paying attention to. That is not nothing. Sometimes the Spirit moves in exactly those quiet ways, not with thunder but with a still, small voice, drawing you towards something more. And if you have never before surrendered your life to Jesus, if you have never before turned to Him, not as a religious obligation, but as the actual living Lord who loves you and gave Himself for you, I want to invite you to do that right now, not in a complicated or formal way, just honestly, just from wherever you are. Tell Him that you need Him. Tell Him that you cannot do this on your own. Ask Him to fill you with His Spirit and to begin the work of genuine transformation in your heart. That prayer is not too small for Him. No prayer ever is. And if you have been a believer for a long time, but this chapter has made you aware that somewhere along the way you began picking that yoke back up again, that somewhere the freedom started to feel more like burden, then I want to invite you to that same place of turning, not as a condemnation, not as a sign that something has gone terribly wrong, but as a gentle and loving invitation back to the source, back to the vine, back to keeping in step with the Spirit, one day at a time, one step at a time, in the company of the one who already knows every step of the path ahead and loves you completely in the midst of all the ones behind. This is what true Christian freedom looks like. Not a life without challenge or difficulty or seasons of confusion. Not a life where you have all the answers or always feel spiritually on top of things, but a life that is genuinely, increasingly, unmistakably marked by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. A life where those things are growing not because you worked so hard to manufacture them, but because the Spirit of God is alive and at work in the soil of your heart. That is the promise. That is the invitation. And that is what is waiting for you on the other side of surrender. I want to close with one final thought, because I think it is the thread that ties everything in this chapter together. Paul ends his words in this section by saying that there is no law against the fruit of the Spirit. And that small sentence is quietly one of the most liberating things in the entire letter. There is no law against love. There is no law against joy. There is no law against peace or patience or kindness. No system, no court, no authority, no religious institution, no voice of accusation inside your own head can stand against the fruit that the Spirit of God produces in a surrendered life. The fruit of the Spirit is its own justification. It is its own defense. When love is growing in you, when genuine peace is holding you, when kindness is flowing from you not because you are trying to impress anyone, but because it has become the natural expression of who you are in Christ, there is nothing left to argue about. The fruit speaks for itself. And I think that is one of the quietest and most profound miracles of the Christian life. That God does not just forgive you and then leave you to figure out how to be different on your own. He comes to live in you. He puts His own Spirit within you. And that Spirit begins, slowly and surely, to produce in you the very character of Jesus. Not as a performance, not as a mask, but as a reality. As something that becomes more and more genuinely, authentically yours as you continue to walk with Him. That is a miracle. It is a quiet one, but it is a real one. And I have seen it happen in lives that seemed beyond the reach of change. I have seen people who were consumed by bitterness begin to move toward genuine forgiveness. I have seen people trapped in anxiety find a peace they could not explain. I have seen people who had given up on themselves encounter a grace that gave them back a sense of direction and dignity and hope, not because they tried harder, but because they surrendered deeper. And the Spirit did what only the Spirit can do. That is the freedom of Galatians Chapter 5. That is the freedom that Christ purchased for you at an unimaginable cost. And it is yours, not someday, not when you are better, not when you have earned it, but today, right now, in whatever moment you are reading these words, as a free and unconditional gift of a God who loves you more completely than you have yet fully understood. Thank you so much for spending this time in the Word with us today. It means more than you know to be able to walk through these passages together, slowly and honestly, and to trust that God is at work in every person who has found their way to this video. Please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel to help us spread the message of Jesus.